Making something. We are recording.
And we're good to go.
Yeah.
All right, so I've got 7:03. I'm gonna call our meeting to order. First, I want to thank everybody for coming this evening to our annual public forum. This is actually the largest attendance we've had during my years. And I'm very grateful for folks coming this evening. I understand we have somebody attending by Zoom also.
Yes, we have. Mr. Benz and Joe Palmer so far.
Great, well, welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our committee member, Grant Farrington, was kind enough and generous enough with his time to put together a PowerPoint presentation for some background on community preservation. That we'll go through momentarily. Thank you. Can you make me co-host?
And can you bring me over, Betsy, when you get a chance to?
Yes.
Thank you.
It seems.
You need to get me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Should the time that
Yes, we can.
oh, I think I have to on my end.
Thank you, Betsy.
Oh, sure.
Do you care? One moment, guys.
Okay, you are. Yep,
Oh, thanks.
you're set.
France,
Was that it? No, it's fine.
could you borrow your laptop presentation, or can you help me navigate where the last link is?
Yeah, no, you can borrow it. Just share it first.
Oh.
We made some changes last week, in fairness. Thank you very much. Great to check the issue. Keeps us all.
All right, so we're required by the Community Preservation Act to host a public forum every year. And we use the opportunity to teach people about the Community Preservation Act, its adoption here in town and about the committee. But really the big goal is to get feedback from the community on projects that they think may be CPA eligible, that may be coming our way so that we can do some planning for the future. Good evening. Hi. Okay, so overview is basically an agenda for the slideshow. Our current members, you'll notice that the last three slots, open space, housing authority, and Shopsy, are not filled. We've got 6 people right now. And we would love to get the other 3 slots.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We would love to get the other slots filled, in particular with the big push now in town to finally get some community housing built. It would be very helpful to us to have members from Housing Authority and Shopsy. Hopefully we can see those seats filled in the near term. So the Community Preservation Act, this is the description from the Community Preservation Coalition. It's a smart growth tool to help communities preserve open space, historic sites, create community housing, develop outdoor recreational facilities. And that's really a good summary of the types of projects that are fundable under the Community Preservation Act. I understand it took a couple of tries to get the CPA, the Community Preservation Act, adopted here in Southborough. And it was ultimately successful at annual town meeting in 2003. The town adopted Article 4, Section 9 of our town code, adopting the Community Preservation Act here in town with a 1% CPA surtax, and creating this committee that portion of our town code talks about the membership of the committee and how the members are appointed and so forth. So the collection of the surtax began in 2003. Later in the presentation, there's a summary of funds that have been collected through this program and from the state match. And it's very interesting to see those. Get to them momentarily. So the committee itself was, the seats were filled for the first time in 2004. And the very first projects were recommended for and approved at annual town meeting 2005. We have a bunch of duties that are by statute. They are listed in the Community Preservation Act, MGL Chapter 44B. To create an application, list the criteria for and process for project funding and oversight. We review applications and then make project recommendations to town meeting. It's an important distinction there that CPC doesn't fund projects ourselves. We recommend to town meeting that town meeting fund projects. We are tasked with developing an annual budget. This has been difficult in the past because we, even when soliciting town boards, committees and commissions and department heads and so forth, other community stakeholders for project ideas, we haven't gotten any ahead of time, which makes it understandably difficult to develop an annual budget. So in developing the annual budget, we simply determine the current status of the Community Preservation Trust Fund and the balances within what we call the CPA buckets. We'll get to that a little bit. And that's all that we've been able to do. We have high hopes for this year to be able to put together an actual. We are also tasked with developing a CPA plan for the town of Southborough. A task that was completed back in 2004. Another task for this upcoming year is that I'm hoping that we can review and update that. The next one, we're doing it tonight, hold the annual public forum to get input from the community. And we use this to educate stakeholders about CPA and the laws, regulation and guidance that we follow, fulfilling our role. So, sort of a common misunderstanding in town. It's the CPA surtax is a 1% surtax. It's not an additional 1% on your property taxes. It's roughly 1% of your property taxes. So the average home in Southborough for fiscal year 2024 paid $110 in surtax. This goes through in some detail how that's all calculated. In particular, the first $100,000 of assessed value of a home is exempt in doing this calculation. And also, there are certain exemptions available for seniors and low-income residents. And these are listed out on the town assessor's website with a form that one can fill out to apply for these exemptions. So the annual budgeting that I referred to before, by law, the surtax receipts under the CPA, as well as the annual state matching funds, have to be divided up into the so-called buckets. There are 4 buckets. 3 of them correspond to the types of fundable projects: open space, historic preservation, and community housing. Each of which get 10% of the total receipts annually. Up to 5% can be spent on administration, and the remainder goes into what's called the budgeted reserve, that remaining 65%. Now, another of the fundable project types is recreation, and by statute that doesn't have its own bucket, but it can be funded from the budgeted reserve or the general unreserved CPA fund balance, which is, we have a balance left over from a previous year, that has not been spent, it goes into the general unreserved balance. So this is well, sort of an estimated snapshot of where we are right now, but we think it's fairly accurate. These are the three buckets, plus our budgeted reserve. The numbers are fairly low right now because we've gone through a few years with some pretty large expenditures. In particular, we have three fairly large bonded projects. The Burnett House at 84 Main Street, the library restoration project, each of those costing roughly $1 million, and then roughly $2 million for the townhouse restoration project. Between those and the other projects we funded, the balances have gone down from where they had been for several years. And I think we are, for my first several years on the committee, there was always more funds available than we had applications for funding. And it made this, frankly, a really fun committee to be on. People come to the committee with great ideas for projects, and we would simply make sure that the projects are fundable under the Community Preservation Act and guidance from the Massachusetts Department of Revenue, and then we'd recommend it to town meeting. We are now, I think, there's a good likelihood that this coming application round, we may have to, for the very first time, decide which projects get funded, because there simply won't be enough funds available to fund everything that comes before us. That'll be a first for the committee. Yeah, so we'll have to find our way through that. So these are some interesting numbers. The total funds collected since the adoption of CPA in Southborough in 2003. In particular, the state match. By adopting the CPA, Southborough has collected in state matches $2.3 million of essentially free money that has gone towards making our community a more vibrant and wonderful place to live. Our last state match in the fall of 2023 was a shade over 21%. Those sort of reading the tea leaves this year are predicting a smaller surcharge, a smaller state match, potentially in the realm of 15 to 17%. We never know until we actually get it, but I think we budgeted 15% and planning for next year just to be conservative. Do I have that correct, Freddie?
Based on estimates, except for it's so early, it's tough. The DOR hasn't given any guidance before we went to town meeting, but also usually or often the Community Preservation Coalition is able to get extra money from the budget at the end of the year that stood up, but we can't. We do due diligence and funding is estimating as reasonable as possible.
Yeah, the Community Preservation Coalition lobbies extensively to try to increase the match, try to find unused state funds in various places that can be applied towards beefing up the match, and they've done a fantastic job. And I will say, even if the match does come in at 15%, it's free money. I think Freddie said this at last annual town meeting. If I could go down to the bank and deposit money and get an instant 15% return, I'd do it in a heartbeat. We'd be crazy not to. Here's where the rubber has met the road through the years. These are just some examples of projects that were recommended by Community Preservation and approved at town meeting. And there are some fantastic ones here. The Bay Hill Playground, the kids have now sort of aged out of it, but we're huge fans. And the playground came out looking absolutely fantastic. I won't go through every single one, but some of the highlights. The Halloran property was another one. We had the funds on hand to purchase outright the generous offer of the Halloran family to sell some 30 acres of land for a shade under $150,000 using CPA funds. 84 Main Street. The town was able to purchase, of course, the preservation restriction, preserving the exterior look of the building and the grounds. The purchase of the conservation restriction at Chestnut Hill Farm has been a topic of discussion lately. But because of that purchase, even with the changes going on there right now with the trustees of reservations and their potential change in the use of the property, that property is preserved in perpetuity. The town's right to use that property under the conservation restriction for passive recreation is protected in perpetuity.
May I jump in?
Please.
Just one correction on the PowerPoint, because I know we have very astute citizens who will notice this. The very first bullet, and this is my fault, Grant, as a recreation member. I got it to you way too late, as in last night. Bayville Playground, Tennis and Basketball Courts, just to clarify, that's Bayville Playground and Basketball Court, which is awesome if you've never driven by there on a beautiful Saturday. And then the Richardson Tennis Courts, the restoration of those at Neary School. So we'll correct that in the presentation. We're aware of that. That is my bad as the recreation member. But nonetheless, all wonderful assets.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, I think we may have done this under admin, the application fees to get the South Union School added to the National Register of Historic Places. The library restoration, of course. On this page, three really important projects here in town: the library restoration, the townhouse restoration, and the St. Mark's Bell Tower. These beautiful historic pieces of our beautiful town center, protected with CPA funds. And most recently, the pickleball courts at the Complex, the Peninsula Trail, golf course irrigation improvements, and in years past, the creation of two affordable homes. This is just a sampling of some of the projects that have been funded through CPA grants. So, the application process. We actually spent some time earlier this year cleaning up that process and putting together a document describing exactly how it works. So the first piece, of course, is there is a physical application. It's going to be available from the CPC webpage, which is part of the town's website. It's going to be available on Friday, June 30th. The application handbook that we put together is meant to accompany the application and to help the applicant wade through the application, figure out what information is needed. And also, it's a guide for us to, so we don't have to try to remember how we've done things in years past, but actually have written down, this is the process. Part of applying for funds is understanding the project funding criteria. That is, what is allowable under Chapter 44B, the Community Preservation Act. We'll get into that in another slide in just a minute. This year, we've adopted a deadline for submittal, and that is August 31st. We had a fairly chaotic year this year, and in fact, we have in a couple of previous years, mostly due to the committee's desire to be as flexible as possible for anyone who might apply. We have ended up taking applications so late in the process that it put us in a terrible bind trying to get the articles put together for a town meeting. We've ended up in a few years literally down to the wire. So we are going to try to prevent that from happening again, for our sake and for the sake of all other stakeholders. So after the submittal of the application, the steps are the project gets presented to the CPC, to the committee. Committee members review, ask questions, make comments, request changes. And ideally, what usually happens is we help craft the proposal into something that we feel will be acceptable to town meeting. We put together an article for the town meeting warrant. Very often, select board and advisory will hold meetings where they discuss the CPC articles and often like to ask the project applicants questions about their project. And then ultimately, the project gets presented at town meeting. We talk with the applicants about the best strategy there. Should the applicant put together a presentation or is that maybe not necessary for certain projects that we know are fairly popular, that we don't need to waste town meeting's time on, that sort of thing. I will say, we've had a pretty good success rate. Since 2003, every single article put forth by community preservation, every single recommendation made has been approved by town meeting. That's a pretty remarkable track record. Okay, so this is the application as it stands right now. I think we have a couple of changes that we'll be talking about later in the meeting tonight after the public forum has ended to get the application in shape for this coming application round. I won't go too deep into the weeds here. It's just a series of questions that we ask about the project, and it's to help the applicant, to help guide them through the process of determining project eligibility. This eligibility matrix is key to figuring that out. Some things that have come up, fairly recently, what is historic preservation? For an open space project, what is passive recreation? How does that differ from a recreation project? This chart is the first step in figuring these things out, and we're explaining in greater depth in the application. Among other things, we also encourage applicants to seek funding from every possible source, not just the CPA. If there are grants or matching funds available, for instance, the Peninsula Trail, Cat McKee was able to find some it appears some matching funds. Obviously, we would want to minimize the amount of CPA funds spent so we can stretch those dollars as far as possible. And we have learned through the years that anything that gets built at some point is going to need maintenance. And it does not make sense to use CPA funds to fund the construction or preservation of something if no means are going to be available, no funds or mechanism for maintaining that thing. We try to be very careful of that. So all town meeting approved projects must submit a project schedule, proposed payment timeline. That schedule will be used to determine a project completion deadline. And one of the changes that we've made in putting together the application handbook is we've adopted a policy now that all CPA grant recommendations from the committee are going to be accompanied by a sunset clause that would be discussed with and agreed with the applicant, but something on the order of the scope of work described in the application will be completed within 2 years or within 3 years, so that we don't end up with funds, with projects that end up hanging out there for several weeks. I was talking about what counts as historic preservation and so forth. This is a more detailed view of determining eligibility for a historical preservation project. The Historical Commission is an integral part of this. They have to review the project and determine whether it's significant in the town's history, archaeology, or architecture, or culture. And there are only certain ways that the funds can be used. So. Pictures of some of the projects. This is a beautiful shot of the South Union School. So 3 separate CPA grants have been made, 2 for preservation of the building, and the 3rd, as I talked about before, for getting it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We typically, so this is a sign for the National Register of Historic Places, but we typically require for a project like this that a plaque be affixed to or adjacent to whatever was preserved or constructed or so forth, saying that it was funded through South Rose Community Preservation Trust. South Union School Playground. In my experience, this was a really big hit in the 2.5 to 6-year-old crowd. My kids at that age, this was where they wanted to go every day. Our library, this project came out absolutely wonderful. The town was fortunate enough for both the library and the townhouse restoration to work with Lynn Spencer at Spencer Boyd Architects, who her work is just absolutely impeccable. She also did the architectural work on the St. Mark's bell tower restoration. I can't speak highly enough of her. Because of her, our 2 buildings, the library and the townhouse, are stunning. So the work in progress, and then the work complete, which is gorgeous, ready for another century. We funded lots of recreation projects for the last decade or so that I've been involved with community preservation. The Mooney Field lights, Henry Tennis Court lights, and then of course Chestnut Hill Farm. And as I said, even with the uncertainty with the trustees and how they're going to continue using the property, our conservation restriction protects the town's interest in this property in perpetuity. Kevin and I have been working very hard on conservation to make sure that continues. The Halloran property, this is myself, 2 other members of the Conservation Commission and our former agent walking the property for the very first time. It's a beautiful undeveloped piece of property lying between Mount Vickery Road and the Mass Turnpike. And at some point, the town will find a way. I think great idea has been advanced to get some access to this so that it can be more widely used. Of course, 84 Main Street, the Burnett House. The volleyball court. You know, not the biggest project we've ever funded, but a hugely popular one, I have to say. So now it's part of the gym curriculum at both Trottier and Geary. And now the school has a yearly volleyball marathon that's become a huge hit. And this is where it takes place. One picture is that this is the top lot portion of the Bayville playground. The football courts. And that's it. So that's the background of the CPA here in town and the Community Preservation Committee. What we do, how we do it. A very rough overview on the application process. Before we get on to the actual, in my view, the most important part, does anyone have any questions so far, either here in the room or in Zoom? Okay, thank you. So, we have a hand raised. Mr. Benz, we will promote you up and we're working on it. Thanks for your patience. Oh, okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, sorry, I don't know why it's showing. I'm Maureen Bensley. I'm from 181 Woodland Road in Southborough. I had a question about the allocation from the state and whether you would know that number prior to the fall town meeting. Because that might affect decisions regarding, how much would be the allocation towards budget and how much would be the responsibility for kind of taxpayers to fill a gap on any projects that were approved.
So there are a couple parts there. First, it depends on the actual date of fall town meeting. As I understand it, that date has not been fixed yet. But the match typically comes in late fall. Is that?
May I?
Yeah, please.
So the match is part of the budget that the CPC creates for annual town meeting in the spring, and they fund projects out of that budget. So the match would have nothing to do with any projects at fall town meeting. It only has to do with projects, this application process Ben just described. People apply for different projects, the CPC reviews them, and then they have a budget. They know what amount of money is in the budget that they can spend, and typically not spend, but authorize funding out of. And this CPC doesn't fund projects that they don't have enough funding for.
Yeah.
So it's based on, they find out how much money is available. We don't even know the surcharge dollar amount until late in the early fall. So that whole budget process goes together at the same time they're reviewing the projects, sort of almost simultaneous.
Thank you, Freddie. Yeah, and Freddie touched on this. The second part of your question, whether the town would have to, if the state match was low, whether the town would have to step in and and make good on the funding for a project. The way the budgeting works is we can only recommend to town meeting an appropriation of funds that are already on hand. We can't be speculative, hoping that we will receive funds in time to fund a project. The appropriation made by town meeting is of funds that are currently on hand to avoid the type of situation that you mentioned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And what about funding? It's like, the 84 main streets, we didn't have the funds on hand for that. So there's no confusion.
Okay, so Lisa Braccio has brought up a very good point. We do, with the advice of town treasurer, typically occasionally bond projects. There are safeguards put in place. For instance, that we can only bond up to something like 70% of our annual surcharge receipts, and we cannot bond against the state match because it's always an uncertain number. So we can't bond against that. Again, that's a safeguard put in place to prevent that type of situation where the town would have to step in. And
This is a mic'd room. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. This is a mic'd room. I just want to make sure you're aware of that. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so I think that, Lisa, I think that
It does,
yeah,
it does. Thank you.
Patty, right?
Hi, yes. I have two questions,
Yes.
actually. You said that the budgeted reserve is 65%. Could you please explain what that 65% of the funds are used for, or how it is used?
Sure. So we have the three buckets for open space, historical preservation, community housing, and a fourth allowable use in the CPA's recreation. Those 10% buckets have to be used for those specific purposes. The 65% can be used for any allowable purpose under the CPA. So if the 10%, for instance, in open space isn't enough.
So it's more like a slush.
I wouldn't use that word only because it can only be used on CPA eligible projects, and we use that for, I think, the St. Mark's Bell Tower is funded not entirely, but mostly through the general. So
Can I make a correction? Not a correction, but an
Please.
additional. So if a project comes in, say the open space or the historical, their 10% is around 30,000, just estimate. You have a project for 100,000, you can spend the targeted bucket plus money from the other. Additionally, recreation doesn't have a bucket, so all of their projects are funded out of, so it's not an extra slush fund, it's a fund that we take money for the CPC would recommend money for a project. So like for the townhouse, $1 million bond, we don't have enough in the historical
So the
bucket.
larger percentage going into that discretionary fund, the unbudgeted, your budgeted reserve is in order to make the discretionary decisions on how it is spent versus having it streamlined into a specific bucket of finance.
Exactly. I think the buckets are established to make sure that some funding goes to each of the areas so that none of them gets abandoned.
So my second question is, you said that the 1% surcharge that we had is not 1% in addition to our taxes. But could you please explain how that is not? And with the select board specifically requesting or looking to increase that to 3%, how would that not be in addition to our taxes that we are paying? Because I don't want to pay more taxes.
No, understood. And it's, I might have done a poor job describing it. It's a surprisingly difficult thing to describe, but once you sort of get your mind around it, it's not that complicated a thing. There has been a misconception that has persisted through the years that it's an extra 1% on your property taxes. In other words, 1% of the assessed value of your home. We've had folks who thought, for my, $500,000 home, just to use a rough number, that it's going to be in the thousands of dollars. That's not the case. It's roughly 1% of your property tax bill. And yes, that's in addition to your property taxes. Indeed, it is. The average right now, it was $110,000 for the average house in town. The select board has talked about, some of the select board members, increasing the CPA rate to 3%, which would triple that amount from an average of 110 to an average of 330.
But how does that not add an additional 2% onto our taxes?
It does. It adds an additional 2% of your property tax bill. The only distinction Penny, that I was trying to make is the misconception that it's not 2% of your property tax bill, but 2% of the assessed value of your house.
That's essentially how all our property tax and expenditures of the tax are figured. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is that it is correct to say that if the select board chooses to support a 3% versus a 1%, that will mean a direct increase in our property tax.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, on the slide, it says that the average is 110 at the 1%, so presumably that would be triple at 3%. It would be 330%.
Yes,
my
correct.
understanding.
And that would also have to be voted on.
And this board hasn't taken a position, just to be clear, this board hasn't taken a position on that.
I think in our last discussion, this committee felt that it's premature to be having that discussion after going through a few years here of remarkable inflation. We were frankly worried that we wouldn't be able to get enough support for such a thing at town meeting.
I doubt you would.
Yeah, and I think we've all, those of us who regularly attend town meeting have learned that if you make an ask at town meeting and it gets turned down, you create headwinds for yourself in the future on something that's already been turned down. If indeed the town is going to ask for this in a serious way, I think we have to wait until the right time to make that ask. In another point the committee brought up was that we don't think it's the right strategy to simply ask for it on a speculative basis. Please voluntarily increase your tax bill so we have more CPA funds. not for any specific purpose, just so we have more CPA funds that we can use. This is something that should be ideally driven by some project with a lot of community support. If there's a CPA eligible project that we can see a couple of years down the road that will have a lot of support in town, then that's the time to start talking about raising the CPA surtax from 1% to 3%. That's, I think I've captured the discussion that we had about that. So we did not vote to support.
No, I understand that there hasn't been any specific communication from the select board or from this board specifically saying we want to present this to increases. But I was misunderstanding apparently the way that you presented it, in that the 1% was not an additional 1% of your taxes.
I probably did a bad job explaining that.
Because it really is.
Oh,
And
no,
if you raise it by 3% to
I
3%,
was not trying to disguise in any fashion that the surtax adds to property tax base. With that, I want to state it emphatically, of course, it absolutely does. The misunderstanding that has cropped up before, even with one of our own members at one point, was misunderstanding 1% of what? That was the misunderstanding. Is it 1% of your current property tax bill? Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Is it 1% of the assessed value of your home? No, that's a much bigger number than what we're talking about. I just wanted to dispel that misunderstanding. That was my only point.
Thank you for the question. Questions?
Yes.
First time at one of your meetings.
Welcome.
Yes.
A lot of questions, but I'm just gonna hold back. So you have 4 buckets, and I'm still trying to understand next year when you anticipate that you'll have, you may anticipate now with the forum and more information coming out, that you might have a lot of projects coming before you. What is the ratio that you strive for between the buckets? And have you looked back in the past to see whether you've gone heavy on recreation or heavy on light on housing, or have you looked at that mix and are you trying to correct for that mix going forward? Especially if you have limited funds to fund all
So-
projects.
As I said, we are entering a new era. I didn't realize this, but when I joined the committee, I think it was 9 years, my very first meeting, I took part in the vote to recommend the very last payment on the bond for Chestnut Hill Farm. And once that payment was made, in subsequent years, of course, it never didn't have to be made again. And all of a sudden, the committee was in a position that there were more funds on hand than there were applicants seeking funding. So the answer to your question is no, we never had to do, we've never done that kind of triaging. Because the funds on hand always exceeded the requests. So what we really were doing was we were making sure that the funding requests comport with the Community Preservation Act, with our town bylaw, and guidance from the Department of Revenue. And if that was the case, we would recommend the project to town meeting. So now, I suspect, but I don't know this for sure, maybe we just won't get a lot of applications, I don't know, but I think there's a very good chance that the funding requests will exceed the funds on hand. And I mentioned that one of the tasks I hope to take on is to go through our community preservation plan. I think we should talk about in that document what our funding goals are and what kind of criteria we will use as we enter this area of having to triage, if you will, requests. I think at that time we will look back historically, what have we funded for recreation, for open space, for historical and affordable housing, and see if there's adjustment in strategy going forward.
thank you. Can I ask
Please.
something? So is your committee, is the purpose of your committee to simply scope out the requests and make the recommendation based on the state criteria if X, Y, and Z are applications and X and Y meet the state criteria, they are allowed to go to town meeting for funding? Or is there a further step in that that your committee then analyzes those project proposals and makes actual recommendations? Are you just weeding out what is not allowed by the state? Or are you looking out for what we want as a community and what we should be spending our money on?
We have the discretion to, we don't just rubber stamp things that are technically, technically comport with all the requirements. We have the ability to, or accept or reject as we see fit.
Yeah, okay, and Grant has it exactly right. And also, I should say, the committee, certainly not in my tenure, has never held a vote on whether to recommend a project or not, and had that vote fail. But what the committee does do is we begin talking with applicants early on in the process, excuse me. And discuss, with the applicant, the kinds of projects that the committee supports and feels that, the community has a need for, that make our community a better place to live. So in a sort of informal sense, that work has been done. But going forward, as I said, we don't have a lot of funds on it. The state match has declined. And I foresee getting into a situation where we're going to have to do that on a much more formal basis. We have, $500,000 in funding requests and, only $250,000 in funds on hand. Numbers I just made up off the top of my head. We're going to have that situation happen where we're going to have to conduct a vote, and a vote will fail. It hasn't happened to date, but it's going to happen in the future.
Could you tell me how the decision-making process happens if the applicant is a private property versus a municipal property?
Yes.
And how is that affected by the requirements of the state to allow that kind of grant?
So, obviously a topic of current discussion here in town, and an important one. Private projects have to comport not only with the Community Preservation Act, town's bylaw, and guidance from the Department of Revenue, but also with the Commonwealth's anti-aid amendment. And that's the big hurdle for private projects. The primary beneficiary of the expenditure of municipal funds has to be the municipality. And the Massachusetts SJC established this 3-step test to determine whether a particular expenditure of public funds with a private entity fulfills that goal. So that's the anti-aid amendment is to ensure that the primary beneficiary of the expenditure of municipal funds is the municipality. Now, to get further into the weeds on this, there are different ways of spending, I'm saying public funds, in this case, we're talking CPA funds, on or with private entities, right? There is, with the St. Mark's Bell Tower restoration, funds were provided directly to St. Mark's to restore the bell tower. That's one way to do it. Right down the road at 84 Main Street, that matter over at Chestnut Hill Farm, the town purchased in one case a preservation restriction, in the other case a conservation restriction. So those funds, they are going to a private entity, but in my mind, it's much more easy to establish who the primary beneficiary of that expenditure is. It's the town. The town is getting something for its money. This protection of this historical asset in perpetuity. Folks may agree or disagree with that, but that's from the perspective of the anti-aid amendment. Conservation restriction, preservation restriction seems to be the recommendation of Department of Revenue when spending public funds for the project. Does that address your question?
I think so. So if you have project one, which is a municipally owned property seeking X money. And property two, which is a privately owned property seeking X money.
Yeah.
And they both fit within the criteria of the state, given the anti-aid amendment, whatever. We can go back to what Grant was saying, is that you have the discretion within this committee to make a decision between project one, municipal property funding, and project two, private property funding.
Yes, please.
Just because I have some experience being on the committee when it first started. Your talk about just seeing if a project fit or not. There were times when the CPC reviewed projects before they became an application even maybe, or a baseline, and worked with the applicant and, maybe didn't get to the application phase because they said this just isn't going to be, there's conversations that happen. So it's not like a vote was taken, we're not going to approve this, and in some cases, several cases, they changed the application up a bit and came
Right.
back another year or
I've seen that
2 years.
Yeah.
So it's not just they approve everything, but there can be, conversations, finessing it, and then coming back with a better project. So that has happened multiple times. Even the library came back, I think.
Yeah.
The library came back. I'm not sure if the townhouse came back.
Yeah, it's. The committee works with each applicant. It's very rare for an application to come in. And for the committee to take, look at it and say, this is perfect, go forward as is. We work with the applicant to put together, first. If there are any places where it doesn't fit with the Community Preservation Act, obviously we address that. And second, we want to make sure it's something that will be acceptable to the community through town meeting. We work extensively with the applicants, putting together projects that we think town meeting will approve. But I think we've been pretty successful. Anything else?
Yes, sure. I just wanted to put back on your radar screen. I know we had talked, about the potential town common restoration of the railing. So I guess what I'm gonna do is just bring back to the select board and the DPW, the deadline is August 31st, put in an application. The initial number that I gave you of the range of between 6,000 and 30,000 is way too low.
Yeah.
What I hope that we can do is working maybe with the Tricentennial Committee, I think might have some interest in this as well, and the Historic Commission.
For a railing?
Well, I don't know if there's any role there at all, but I know that, this has been talked about the Historical Commission, right, this project.
Yes, in fact, Kevin Miller brought it up with me, that group, in late winter.
Yes, okay, so we need to sharpen our pencils about
Yeah.
what is the exact scope of the work. But August 31st is the deadline.
Applications are available June 30th.
And 24, not
Is
23.
it really just a one page, like 2 pages there? 2
Yeah,
pages
yeah,
project narrative?
It's 3 or 4, I
Okay.
think in total.
Okay,
You want Hannah White over
Yeah.
yeah,
A lot of it's
Put
charts.
Vanessa on it.
A lot of it, there you go. A lot of it is charts that we saw up there, so you can have them for reference. The handbook.
Yep.
Will be available June 30th as well, online, so you want to read that first.
Yeah, the handbook also has links to, guidance from the DOR, to, the Community Preservation Act itself, our bylaw, and a number of other resources that may be helpful to folks. Go for the application.
I would just add too, like, anyone inclined, don't go down the road if you're not sure. Stop, call any one of us, come into a
Absolutely.
meeting.
Yeah.
We got lessons learned. I'm always learning. What didn't work and why, so we can maybe get ahead of that with people.
Absolutely. I'm always available by email. Our emails are posted on the town website. And we are always willing to talk with people about potential projects. But first, Betsy, do we have any hands up? Okay. Okay. Great.
Also, if you have ideas for a project for next year. It's a good idea if you have a long-term outlook that you can plan ahead, Start now, come back next year to a committee. Some projects are longer term, that you want to do it, it's not ready to go, so.
And it brings up another point. We would like to, desperately like to, be able to plan for the future. Or just to some extent here, if we know a project is coming in 2 or 3 years, that would influence our decision as we are, I keep calling it trio, I got to put a better phrase for it, but weighing various projects. You know what? Maybe there's a really important project that's going to be coming in 2 years that we need to be setting funds aside for, and that would influence our decision. And we want to be able to do that. Now, I had we're now getting into the realm of seeking out ideas. I had a wonderful conversation with Kevin Miller back in late winter, and he mentioned a couple of projects he had seen around town that I think the historical commission sounds like would support. Number one, the railing on Common Street. Ever since you pointed that out, it's all I see now when I drive past it. It's and it will look very sharp when it is restored. Another one, it's funny. My kids went to school next door for a couple of years, and we used to, in warmer months, walk through the cemetery from Middle Road over to the school, and I walked past what I never knew was an old water tower that was used for watering at the cemetery. And surprisingly enough, it's that brown tower. Apparently the roof is beginning to fail on that, and it sounds like the masonry could probably use a little bit of touch up too. It's an interesting structure with a very interesting history. He suggested that as a potential project. And then I believe the third one, I have to circle back to that and make sure I've got this right. I think one of the stone walls along the old burial ground is in need of some work. That was the third project you mentioned. So really, for one of the first times, we have some knowledge of projects that may be coming our way, and we know about them before we actually receive an application. And we would like more of that. If anyone has an idea for a potentially CPA fundable project, even if you aren't able to be the actual proponent yourself, we on the committee here might be able to steer that project towards somebody who could take it on, and we would welcome ideas for something that we could steer towards, whoever, DPW through the select board, for example, or whatever. We would love to hear ideas from anyone in the community.
Another one to throw out is, might be coming forward is fire truck
Oh, of course, yes,
as well.
Yep.
So that's another one on the radar that we don't know if they're gonna bring back or not. but
right,
This discussion.
yes,
Another one that might be coming forward, but this is, I don't think in this fiscal year, but is the Murray Building School project where if there's some realignment of athletic fields, I don't know if that's something where that's CPA eligible. I mean, one of the reasons I'm mentioning it is, you remember the Gonflex project,
Yes.
which passed, of course, but the advisory committee voted not to support it.
yes,
The only reason was really to just, I know, Mr. Pfaff felt very strongly that there was an opportunity to use CPA funds to reduce the overall cost of the project. And it just as a matter of the timing, didn't
Yeah.
work out. So, I mean, the Neary Building School project is moving pretty quickly. So, just under the MSBA timeline, I believe by August 31st, which is also the same time
Yeah.
as your application, there's going to be a winnowing of the different options down
Okay.
to one. So, but I think then you'll have a little bit more clarity. Then it would have to, of course, be passed by town meeting.
Yeah.
Then you have a little bit more clarity about what piece of it might be CPA eligible.
I think you hit the nail on the head with recreation type stuff. Recreation, within certain guidelines, recreation projects are fundable under CPA. We certainly have funded athletic field construction, lighting, field restoration, field drainage work.
I just want to underscore, you shared a picture of the Scouts project, the volleyball court.
Yes.
But I think that's just important because we work, recreation works with Scouts quite a bit as well. But just so any Scout leaders out there remember, any students remember that this is another potential source of funding that I think maybe they aren't necessarily familiar with.
And
And I
I,
would, sorry, if I can just, and I would recommend, Andrew, that as that moves down the path and starts to move forward, that there's collaboration with the Recreation Commission. As well, so to get support for.
See, I'm sorry, I don't really know the specifics.
Right, no, I'm just saying, though,
Spotting the
It's,
issue
it's,
for
you're
2 years.
like kind of throwing the idea out there and, you know, just generally. I'm just generally saying as well that working with recreation would probably bring a lot of support towards getting that to pass time.
and I just have to jump back once. I said something that I'm trying desperately hard not to do. I use it as shorthand. And I've been called out on it in the past. I said, we have funded a lot of recreation projects. We don't fund projects, we make recommendations.
Yeah.
We use that language as sort of a short, as a shorthand. So we don't have to spit out the whole mouthful. I've been trying to get away from it, but I just want to make clear, community preservation doesn't fund projects. We make recommendations to town meetings. And if I slip up again, it's unintentional. Making sure it would. Okay. Yeah, I think to Lisa's point, finding the right project proponent, can have a huge impact on success at town meeting. And even in a sort of a cohesive project like the Neary School, there are parts where it may, for CPA purposes, be helpful to have a separate proponent for instance, recreation components. And see, we have a hand up again.
This has been said, Ben. All right.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, it's Maureen Bensley. I just, in light of the comments about kind of expanding the scope of projects, I wanted to just make you aware, my son is an 8th grader at Trotter, and part of the curriculum is having the students do a community action plan where they're proposing projects and getting graded on those. I don't know if the committee is kind of participating in that, but he really did enjoy that process and kind of understanding what it would take to go through the process of permitting and going through how you could make that project a reality. So I apologize if that's something you're already involved with, but
It's not, and we probably should be. I have 2 8th graders at Trotter. It's a fantastic idea, and thank you.
Yeah.
For sharing that. And you have one entering 8th grade. next
Yeah,
year.
it's like, I love that for my rising eighth.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so, as folks go back to their boards, committees, commissions, if, please, you know, ask these bodies if they have any ideas, for CPA eligible projects. And again, not necessarily as the proponent, perhaps we could link an idea to a proponent and get it moving that way. And I will reach out again to capital planning and advisory. They seem to have ideas for CPA eligible projects. And I appreciate the ideas that we've been given here this evening.
And should we open it up to attendees to see if they have any ideas?
Yeah,
He has been.
Oh,
For several
Yeah,
times
if-
already. Yeah.
obviously, if anyone here has any further ideas, please let us know. Like I said, it's what I in putting together our application handbook, I ended up looking into the community preservation committees of a bunch of towns and cities. And it would be wonderful if we could get a handle on what's coming down the road over the next few years, so that we can do some actual budgeting as we get into somewhat leaner times with community preservation. Other municipalities have already reached that point. And I've seen, you know, how they are able to address it. Without barely being said.
So thank you for coming. So are we done with the forum?
Is there another slide?
For another slide.
I think that's the last.
Yep, it's our website.
So I just have one more comment.
Oh,
So
of course.
I came here with 3 points, which mostly we've discussed, and I do appreciate all the work that you do for the community. The first, of course, was the additional proposed 2% increase, which is no doubt going to increase our taxes.
Oh, yeah.
And with incredible amounts of money currently in the purview for schools and renovations, I don't think that's advisable. And I will not support it. The second was, as some people already know, I have a real problem with taxpayer funding of private property projects. And I think that needs to be under consideration here, that we as a community need to be very, very careful of how you are spending our hard-earned taxpayer dollars, and if that goes to private property. I don't think that is a wise use of municipal funding. My third comment, which I'm sorry to bring up, but I've watched many of your meetings, not in real time, but going back and looking at it, and then I've gone through and tried to find information on specific applications that were put forth or discussions on those applications. And as I'm sure you are well aware, that information is not publicly available. That is in violation of the Massachusetts State Open Meeting Law. Any discussion of an application needs to have that application as part of the packet and publicly available. And I have gone back months, and you do not have that information publicly available. You do mostly have up-to-date meeting minutes, but there is no packet. There is no information about, there is no documentation of the information that you are discussing in those meetings. And that is a violation of state open meeting law. So I would ask that you please correct that very quickly for the benefit of all of us that would like to see and have access to those applications and to find out who is asking for money from our funded CPA, but also because it is a requirement for the state.
Now, you're talking about available online? So you're.
Yes.
Okay.
Those documents need to be supplied to the town clerk and put in as part of your packet online for public accessibility. And it is not.
It's something to be worked on in summer.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, this
Yeah.
is going back months. I mean, I started looking for some of these things back in October and November of last year.
So,
And there were members that were very kind and forwarded me that information.
Yeah.
But that needs to be publicly available, or it becomes an issue with the state if someone makes a
yep,
complaint.
understood. And so I took over as chair almost exactly a year ago, and there are a number of efforts that I've taken on to sort of get us into shape. The first was the application process. Another one that we are working on right now is return of funds from projects that have been completed, returning those funds back to the Community Preservation Trust Fund that they are truly no longer needed. And this is obviously
That's all
another
great.
important-
That's all great
Understood.
and very important,
and
but
and
this is a
too important.
requirement for the state.
This too is important.
And if Joe Schmo like me out
Yeah.
there wants to find information about a meeting that you had and an application or information that you presented in that meeting, that document
Mhm.
needs to be publicly available. That is a requirement of the state.
Yeah.
Unlike many committees and boards in this town, you do have paid help. I don't think that, I think that should be a priority
Mhm.
to get this committee up to a state requirement.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's obviously something that we're going to be working on. If in the interim, in the very near term, if there's a piece of information that you need, you don't have access to, please get in touch and we'll find it, we'll provide it. Now, I understand you're talking, the community at large needs access to this information.
Yes.
Point taken and understood, and we're gonna be taking that on, saying it in the interim, you or anybody else has information that you need. By all means, get in touch, and let me just tell you, the intent is not to keep anything secret. We
I
will.
don't
we'll get
assume
the
it
information.
is. I don't assume it is. I assume it's a time issue, but it needs to be a priority because it is state requirement.
Understood and appreciated, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie.
Oh. You had, I'm sorry, but you had brought up one other issue, and that is the use of CPA funds on private property. So intelligent people can disagree. Number one, I, in fact, have actually voted against a CPA project at town meeting largely for the reasons that you described. Nonetheless, it's an unfortunate fact that I would suggest the majority of Southborough's history is in private hands. And, one of our roles is to help to preserve Southborough's history. And it's impossible to do that with many different types of history if we are not helping to restore historical artifacts or properties or what have you that are in private hands. And it's as I talked about before, it's further complicated by, what does it mean to spend public funds with a private party? If we're purchasing a preservation restriction, is that the same thing as providing funds for the actual preservation work? Or, when we're working with a nonprofit like the restoration of the Buck Fanlon flag with the Southborough Historical Society, they are a private organization where we're using public funds for that. So it's I guess what I'm saying is it's a complicated issue. I certainly understand your perspective on it. I know it's shared by many in the community and something that the committee takes very seriously.
No, it is. It's a complicated issue. I just see this as a slippery slope that we've been going down over the last decade here in this town, that more and more of these projects seem to be geared toward private properties.
Yeah.
And, I'm just one voter here, but if you ask me to spend, if I had a choice between spending my taxpayer dollars on a municipal owned property or a hiking trail that, was municipally owned that I could access, or if I was to spend it on restoring the exterior of a building that was owned by a multi-million-dollar business or nonprofit, there is no question where that money in my mind should be going.
Understood. Yeah, my point wasn't to argue for or against, but just to
I understand. It's a
just about the
complicated issue.
complexity of the whole. Thank you. All right, is there anything else?
You're welcome to stay for the rest of our meeting, or you can escape when you can. We can't, but we appreciate you coming here.
What's the rest of the meeting?
What do we have? We have finalized letters of expectations, for town meeting 2024 projects, finalized closing out. Finished pickleball courts, update on Johnson farmland, discussion of members reappointment, chair's report. Really interesting stuff.
It's gonna be fascinating.
I
It's gonna be
mean,
riveting.
we're giving you the option here, you can escape before we move forward. See, Andrew's already out, he's bailing, thank you for coming, Andrew.
Yeah, so I think,
Oh, you just.
I think we may take a couple minute break here. Before we,
Okay,
People
3-minute break.
yeah.
3-minute break.